We had a so rich discussion. We had people from all over the world, very knowledgeable about this topic. We had businesses, governments, representatives from civil society, social innovators, campaigners. We had everybody that we need to develop such a solution on the topic of food waste reduction. We know we have this overarching ambition as set by the SDG 12.3, halving food waste with 50% in 2030. But we started off with putting it in the right context. We are aiming for contributing to a sustainable and healthy food system, and we should never forget that. We also found, and that's one of the first challenges that we found, and as that there is a universal problem because food waste is all over the place. It's all over the world. It's in developing countries, it's in developed countries, it's in all part of the supply chain and in the consumers. But there is not a universal or a global solution. And what we also found is that you need to go back to the regional, the local, the national levels to really understand the drivers and the cultures. And if you don't do that, you cannot come up with the right solutions. So we have to overcome the differences and the culture of some countries. There are plenty, some countries where there is lack of availability of food within that local concept. What we also agreed, and that has been discussed also in many other podia, is how to get countries and businesses to report in a standardized way. As been explained and mentioned already by Michiel this morning, we have a very good chance of using the food loss and waste protocol that has been created by a large group of stakeholders as the example that is neutral and that can be used to any organization to measure food loss and waste. But the next step is also to become transparent on that. And there's good models out there that should be used, that should be harnessed, but that will also take leadership and partnership to be able to do that. Awareness is very important, but we got the feeling that we are ready for the next step. It's not only awareness, but you also look at the attitude and finally the impact is in the behavior change. So we should work on the social norm. You should not waste food and do that together. And that's what you need. And we have seen examples where this can be done. Another important thing that we know there's hundreds. There's more than 1,000 initiatives globally to reduce food loss and waste. How do we create impact with those? How do we scale up the good ones? How do we make people aware of these good initiatives? That was also a very important challenge that we identified. Looking more at at a makeable world, the ideal world, where does food waste and loss come from? Suppose in the future, and we see the trends in that direction, that our supply chain can be much more consumer responsive. If we use big data approaches, transparency on data, we can much better predict what the consumer needs, and personalized nutrition is a trend where we also can see that sustainable, with no food waste, supply chains can be developed. We think that this future is not so far away, but it all comes down to data transparency being very important, and what we also discussed, fit in the local context, and having the consumer always the last choice to say, it's my food, I decide what I buy, but we think by giving good advice and showing the benefits that can be done. That are the major challenges that we identified. Let's come up with the solutions. Of course, it was important, and that's an easy one, to work further on alignment of monitoring, but also not only monitoring of data, but also sharing best practices. Working on the business models with businesses, where we have seen several business models that are very positive already. But how do we make them visible? How can we create that not only the front runners are aware of those and pick their benefits, but also the followers, we call them the imitators, will make sure that it happens all over the business. A very important role where a platform, and I don't think of a platform like having all people together standard, but how to connect to existing platforms using the network of the chefs that's already international, using the network of Consumer Goods Forum, using the network that's already existing to create a platform to share data and best practices. We mentioned a lot about partnerships, public-private partnerships, and several models came across, where sometimes the discussion was, what's the role of government, what's the role of businesses, and we agreed that we need them all. But again, the local circumstances will decide on how best can be collaborated between these different partners. Where governments have a role to play in facilitating this, and sometimes also remove barriers, and that can sometimes be legal barriers. But we also had some good emotional interventions on the public interest. That also needs to be part of such a, if that's part of the culture of a country, you should not forget that sometimes public interest needs to be taken care of also by governments and could urge some pressure for businesses or for others to act. Reframing of the concept, very important. We talk about food waste, but nobody likes the topic and the word and the semantics of food waste. So we believe it is time to reframe and change the mindset to thinking about utilization. Because it's, if you talk utilization, if you talk about good food, you don't waste good food. So that's an important aspect. And then the last 2 points I want to make is on education. Education was mentioned many times as a very important driver for change. Start with young people, because if young people value food, and we've seen that, then they don't waste it. They can change, they can be the consumers of the future, and if they value the food, they're willing to pay a good and decent price for the food, they will not waste it, and it will drive the whole supply chain. And the last, and I think that was also very much agreement on that, gastronomy is really a driver and an innovation for better food. So let's better use the chefs and use the international network, and they can work on the prevention, make sure that we get good food and show the value of food, but they are also creative. We've seen examples where chefs were able to produce excellent quality of food that was considered by current food supply chain partners as food waste. So that's definitely a take-home message for use gastronomy as an innovator for better food and get all these people on board to show that it works. Thanks for your attention.